Let's stay with that particular story and also just talk about this because, I mean, the statistics are quite disturbing. You think about 20 children being assaulted every day. You're thinking about the fact that 3 children murdered in South Africa every single day. Let's speak now to Advocate Brenda Madumise, who's the director at the WISE Collective, and forensic psychologist, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne. Thank you so much to you both for your time. It's a very difficult conversation, to have this afternoon. And we look at that front page story by the Sowetan today, really a harrowing front page that we looked into. But I'll start with you, Dr. Labuschagne. I mean, we read the details of what is said to have happened to Bukhaba, in the last moments. This is a man who is said to have, been carrying a packet of sweets, and people in the area know him, calling him Harry Potter and all of that. He always hung around children. But this is just one of those cases. I wonder, what kind of human being, what kind of man commits such horrendous acts?
Well, I think, we have to be careful to assume that all child murders have the similar motive. They're going to have different motives. Typically, the majority of children who are murdered, the younger they are, it's more likely to be a caregiver, such as a parent or someone who's looking after them, someone in their very close immediate environment. Then you also get your predatory types of murderers, those that are out looking for a victim that's often sexually motivated in nature. And those will be very often 2 different types of people. So one must be careful not to lump them all together as if there's one solution and one motive, because then we're just going to sort of miss out in effectively dealing with this problem. And I do think we lack in South Africa, quite amazingly so, a lot of crime research. I mean, I'm always amazed that we don't spend a lot of funding on actually researching the crimes that we all get so outraged about. And that just doesn't seem to happen. So, if we don't understand what we're dealing with, no strategy we implement is ever going to be effective, because it's going to be haphazard in nature.
And as you say then that, when we do not invest in the research around the crimes, we also will not know who is committing these crimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we don't know the circumstances. I mean, is it typically, like I said, as the general research says, is it someone who's known close to the victim? Do we know in terms of the age differences? Is it more likely to be like you say, an associate in the neighborhood versus a family member versus a neighbor versus a stranger? And we're very quick to get outraged in South Africa. I mean, every now and then you hear of a horrific crime that's been committed, typically against women or children, and the whole society gets outraged. And then a week later, we've moved on and nothing's changed. And that's really our own fault. We need to have more staying power, and we need to invest more in understanding these types of things so we can understand better what are the contexts under which it occurs. Can we prevent those contexts? Can we focus more policing efforts on those particular areas? Do we need to involve schools more? If it's a child who's been eventually murdered by a caregiver or a parent, you cannot tell me that's a spontaneous thing where there were no preceding history that tells us that there are concerning behaviors taking place that we need to step in and look at. When a parent or a caregiver murders a child, I can almost guarantee you there would have been previous incidences of concern, of violence towards that child, but what was done about it? And that's the type of stuff that if we don't study, we're just going to have this repeating itself at the same rate or even worse. And of course, then you also have to look at the justice system. Are we catching the people committing these crimes and getting them sentenced to appropriate sentences? Because if we don't do that, if people don't fear being caught by the police and successfully prosecuted, then it doesn't really matter what else we do, because they know there's no consequences for their behavior.
And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. I'd like to come to you, Advocate Madumise. One really looks at the headlines, and as Dr. Labuschagne says, that there's so much that happens, society gets outraged, we talk about it, then we move on. But I wonder, for you tonight, are we a nation that hates our children?
I think good afternoon. I think we're a nation that hates ourselves completely. I mean, our conduct in almost everything that we do, whether it's going through a red traffic light, whether it's microaggression that we show to each other when we're in the shopping complexes, the road rage that we show to each other, on the road, it gets reflected almost in every environment and every aspect of our lives. So the violence that we see that is perpetrated against women and children, it's a reflection of who we are, because on a daily basis, that's how we carry ourselves. We are violent, we are with microaggression on a daily basis. We don't want to observe rules. We don't want to be told that something is wrong. We want to lash out every time. We don't want to engage and understand what the point or the position that the person is coming from. So yes, we do hate ourselves, and we hate everything that we represent and we are about. And that's why it becomes very easy to move on from one crisis to another, because really what we are doing is being performative in our outrage. And so the very few who have got the staying power that Dr. Labuschagne is talking about are left on their own to continue to fight the scourge, but the majority of us have moved on and will lash on the next thing on social media and feel good about that because we have said something, but that's where it stops.
And talking about that very aspect, Advocate Madumise, before I go back to Dr. Labuschagne, usually when there's outrage and we see the trends on social media, the hashtag is trending, other people see this as heeding the cries of the children, you know, that go missing, others are murdered. They see it as heeding, you know, their cries. But are we really hearing them? Are we really deaf, though, to the cries of our children?
You know, I think we're talking at cross purposes as South Africans at the moment. This government walks left and talks right. And we're all caught up in that dysfunctionality because no matter how much sense you want to bring in onto the table, you have a tone-deaf administration that is not willing to accept and willing to pool all the resources. I mean, you've got people who have been working on these issues for the longest of time, who can share some ideas on what needs to happen. Once you are not willing to engage, but you want to engage with specific individuals, and I think that's where I find this whole thing debilitating, because if you don't bring in almost the people who can assist you to get to the right answers and find solutions and keep on doing the same thing because you think you know and you know alone, you're not going to resolve anything. You're going to do the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different outcome. And that's not going to happen. We have not, and I want to deal with this quickly. We have got a strategic plan on gender-based violence, and children are part of that, right? It's got 6 pillars in it. The research component that needs to look at evidence-based solutions and interventions is there. But how many of South Africans have engaged with that document and found solutions? The very same government has not even funded that plan adequately so that it can start to deliver. And remember, once you put resources on it, you are not going to receive the results immediately. It's about starting something and being consistent and constant with your interventions, and that's the only time the message will resonate, because you're consistent. You're not directed by what's happening. Once there's a murder, once there's a rape, once there's an assault, once there's sexual harassment, your interventions and strategies are consistent and constant because you are working on them on a daily basis and not driven by outrage on social media.
And so, Dr. Labuschagne, back to your point, I mean, you know, listening to Advocate Madumise, it goes back to the research, putting in the work that is needed in this regard. And we often hear sometimes, Dr. Labuschagne, that, you know, others will say some of the backgrounds of the killers show a chaotic background of some sort. Others will say that, no, something must have died in this particular individual to be able to commit such heinous acts. What would have died in a person to see a 4-year-old as someone to be raped and murdered?
Again, that's a difficult. I don't think there's one answer to all the people who do that same kind of crime. So I think we often want to find excuses, or not excuses, but explanations, whether it's blaming foreigners for everything or blaming this or that or the other. And that typically doesn't get us anywhere. And even if you do find these offenders, and I saw this many times in the cases I testified in when I was still working for the police, you know, people commit horrific acts. Some of them have traumatic backgrounds, but so do a large portion of children in our society, but they grow up to be normal, upstanding citizens. So That's not the cause. Far more people who've had horrible upbringings become good members of society, and some who have normal upbringings do horrible things. So again, that's not going to give us the answers to this. There's not going to be lovely, clear warning signs for many of these individuals. And often when you find out who these people are, it's seen as the trusted member of the community or someone who wasn't seen as a threat to people. That's often why they're successful in getting away with these things for a period of time. And it comes back to exactly what Advocate Madumise said. We need to start studying this and stop going on with what politicians like to comment on, what they think the public wants to hear, things that kind of touch on the public sentiment. We need to get over ourselves, study what we're dealing with, invest in that research, get the best people to do it, and then start saying, this is what we've assessed, this is what we think is a scientific way forward. Not, as I said, the politicians love to say really interesting things that just are there often just to appease the public. And that's not how we're going to solve our problems by those types of comments. And social media, the cause of these crimes isn't the lack of social media. So the fact that everybody wants to give their 2 cents on social media is not going to prevent it. Exactly as Advocate Madumise said, it's often just us making ourselves feel like we've done a little part. I'm not saying that's wrong, but that's not going to change anything.
And Advocate Madumise, when Dr. Labuschagne talks about social media, I'm thinking about, 16 days of activism. It's coming up. We're going to be seeing, lots of trends around that. And I see you rolling your eyes as I talk about this. It's another campaign. It's going to come. We'll keep hearing about the stories. But as you say, it doesn't look like we're getting to the nub of the issues, are we, Dr. Madumise? I mean, Advocate Madumise, pardon me.
It's okay, Bongiwe.
I'm giving you a new title now.
No, I'm being lifted. Thank you. These you see, we can't continue to have these events, and because they're really events, because they're meant to get us to be there, all of us, and we all say the right things, and we go back to our respective fields and homes and continue with our lives. And I think what is missing in all of these things, I want all of us to pause for a second, and especially this government to pause for a second and ask themselves the question, if you have said to this nation that gender-based violence is a pandemic, and I want the president and his ministers and the coterie of all decision makers to hear me today. If you believe that is a pandemic, your response to it is not that of a pandemic. And maybe today, as we are on this platform, is for you to consider a coordinated response to all of these things and the entire value chain. So you're not going to look at gender-based violence in isolation of what's happening in the economy at the moment. You're not going to look at gender-based violence in isolation of what's happening in education. We're not going to look at gender-based violence in isolation of what's happening in health. It's all interconnected. So let's stop being myopic and fragmented and having silos in how we approach gender-based violence and find solutions for them. Because if you put it as in a silo somewhere, you are not going to get the answers. And that's why we are here. That's why we'll continue to be called by the SABCs of this world to come and speak about these matters, because the fragmentation that is happening, it's overwhelming. Yeah. So this government has to take a decision today that if you have a coordinated approach on corruption as a country, you have a fusion center where you bring all the law enforcement agencies into one room and tackle it as a problem. You have to do that for gender-based violence. We cannot keep on saying the same thing over and over again. If it's a pandemic, the way you dealt with COVID-19, deal with gender-based violence, because it's that serious, it's ravaging this country. We are not going to make inroads about productivity in this country. You're not going to make inroads about children being in school. You're not going to make inroads about functioning hospitals if you don't deal with it the same way that you have to deal with it in the same way as we dealt with the pandemic. And for me, that's the crux of it. And we are going to make this call. We have made it before, but I think we need as many voices as we can to force this government to look at gender-based violence as they have said, it's a pandemic. Now your responses must respond to a pandemic, not this laissez-faire, lackadaisical approach that you have at the moment, where you think by visiting the victim's family, you have done enough. Stop with that nonsense. It's not taking us anywhere.
Dr. Labuschagne, I'm going to give you the final bite here. We've got parents watching tonight, and usually when you hear parents, they'll say that, you know, my child, as long as my child is playing near the home, as long as my child is where I can see them, they're not going to go missing. So I do have a handle on the situation, but it's not always as you know, as safe as that for them. They may need to be extra cautious.
Absolutely. We know that the majority of sexual abuse of children occurs within people that's known, family members, neighbors, family friends, etc. So it's not to say that the stranger danger concept isn't something we should communicate to our children, but the majority of them are being targeted by people that we know by name, by first name, that we know well, that we often can't believe that when we hear that that person was molesting our child. So we have to also teach our children that, you know, the danger can also come from within our immediate environments, the uncle, the friend, as I said, the neighbor, and that we need to know and communicate to them that it's okay for them to bring that information to us, and that we will respond to it. And that's really where the danger lies. More likely is going to be from somebody that you already know towards your children.
And as Advocate Madumise says, it's a pandemic and it really warrants that kind of response. So thank you so much to you both. Do appreciate your time. That was Advocate Brenda Madumise, Director at the WISE Collective, and forensic psychologist Dr. Gerard Labuschagne.